Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Gaudette, and welcome back to another installment of Top 5 Albums, the series where I take you through my 5 favorite albums from each year. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the year 1967, which was a pivotal year in music and culturally. We saw a massive shift happening with the Summer of Love, a lot of protesting, a lot of people experimenting with LSD, and I would say that this is the peak year for psychedelic music. We saw some psychedelic elements start to be introduced into music in 65 and 66. But 67, I think, is really the year of the psychedelic explosion, with most popular bands from that time incorporating at least some psychedelic elements to their sound. And we saw a lot of debut albums come out this year from different artists and bands who would go on to become key figures of the musical movement of the 60s. And when it comes to the music that came out of the 60s, I would say that my two favorite years would be 66 and 67. I think those were really transformative and pivotal years for 60s music, with just a creative explosion coming out of so many different bands and artists. So I'm very excited to be covering this year for today's episode. And without further ado, here are my top 5 favorite albums of 1967, starting with number 5. Okay, coming in at number 5, we have the debut studio album from Van Dyke Parks titled Song Cycle. For anyone who isn't aware of Van Dyke Parks, he is a songwriter, an arranger, and a record producer who has produced and arranged on so many different albums over the years, but the thing that he's probably the most well known for is his contributions to the Beach Boys album Smile, where he had contributed some instrumental stuff as well as writing a lot of the lyrics on that album. And I think he was somebody who worked particularly well with Brian Wilson, because I think they are both very unique songwriters with a lot of cool, individual sensibilities that are very unique to them and their songwriting styles. And this album is a very clear example of that. This is not your conventional 60s pop album. And I will say, of the 5 albums that I'm going to be covering today, this is probably the one that not everybody is going to resonate with. I think it's definitely an acquired taste, and I think you need to have a specific kind of ear to really get a lot of enjoyment out of a record like this. Stylistically, there is so much stuff going on throughout this, with some orchestral and Baroque pop elements, as well as art rock mixed with some pop, classical, avant-garde, bluegrass, and ragtime, and just a really interesting fusion of a lot of different styles that makes for a very unpredictable and very enjoyable listen. And because of how ambitious and daring this album is, I think it was a little too ahead of its time when it came out in 1967. I think it was probably above a lot of people's heads, and is one of the reasons why not many people know about this album. If you're a diehard music fan who checks out a ton of albums, you've probably heard of this, but for just, the typical music listener and somebody who's a fan of 60s music, you may not have heard of this one before, and I think that's one of the reasons why. I just think it was a little too ahead of its time when it initially came out. But if you're the type of music listener that likes stuff that's unpredictable, daring, takes a lot of chances, and goes in all sorts of unexpected territories, this album completely delivers on that front. It's got 12 tracks, with 10 of them being originals and 2 covers. The songwriting is very interesting, with all sorts of unexpected key changes and really colorful chord movements, as well as really rich and lush orchestrations that give off a very cinematic sort of feel at times. It's got amazing string sections, awesome piano writing, great vocal writing, and I really love the recording style of the vocals on this album. I think the way that it works against the instrumental sections creates a very cool effect. But I think this album is a lot of fun. It's incredibly unique, and for a complex songwriter like Van Dyke Parks, who takes from so many different influences, I think this album is a great amalgamation of all of those unique flavors that he is influenced by that makes this album so uniquely him. And in my opinion, I think this is one of the more underrated albums of 1967. My personal favorite songs on here are The All Golden, Palm Desert, Widow's Walk, and the Randy Newman cover of Vine Street, which opens the album up so beautifully. And I will say that this is an album that I do need to be in a particular mood to listen to. I don't find myself going back and listening to this one all the time, but that certainly does not negate how great I think this album is and how much I appreciate Van Dyke Parks as a musician and a songwriter. I think he is a very unique figure to come out of 60s music and somebody who really deserves a lot more recognition and appreciation for the very unique contributions that he has left to the world of music. And he's still alive to this day, actually. So I would check him out for sure if you've never heard of him. And like I said, this album may not be for you, but I think it's worth a listen just to see what you think of it regardless, because for the right listener, this can be a very enjoyable experience and something very out of the ordinary that does not sound like anything else that you have heard. I will guarantee you that. So that is it for my number 5. Now on to number 4. Coming in at number 4 is Younger Than Yesterday by the Byrds. The Byrds have made some really incredible contributions to 60s music, and in my opinion, this is one of their strongest albums. Their previous album, Fifth Dimension, is the one that's known for being their more psychedelic album, and this one still incorporates some psychedelic elements, but also veers off into some other territories with some folk rock and even a little bit of country. The album has 10 originals and one Bob Dylan cover titled My Back Pages, and when it comes to the individual members of the group, I think this album has some really great individual songwriting contributions from each of them and shows how they complement and balance each other very nicely, with really strong individual tracks being written by Roger McGuinn, David Crosby, and Chris Hillman, who had not written any individual tracks on his own prior to this album. And I actually think a couple of the songs that he wrote on here are some of the highest points of the album, with tracks like Have You Seen Her Face and Thoughts and Words. And Roger McGuinn and David Crosby both contribute great tracks individually as well as in collaboration with one another and in collaboration with Chris on tracks like So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star, Renaissance Fair, You've Been Burned, and the closing track, Why, which might be my favorite closing track of any Byrds album, really ends the album on a very great note. But I think the Byrds were on the top of their game at the release of this album. We saw them shift their style and go into more of a psychedelic direction on the previous album, Fifth Dimension, and I think that album was a great jumping off point for them to continue to refine their sound and find a really great blend of each of them from a compositional and stylistic perspective, and it resulted in an album that I think is very enjoyable with a lot of great variety and a lot of really exceptional tracks that showcase each songwriter in a very great way. And like I said, I think this is one of the best Byrds albums of their entire discography. So if you haven't checked this one out, I would highly recommend it. So that is it for my number 4. Now on to number 3. Coming in at number 3 is Disraeli Gears by Cream. This is my personal favorite Cream album. It features this great blend of blues, psychedelic rock, and hard rock, which makes for a very fun and adventurous listen. And as a guitar player, when it comes to some of my favorite rock guitar players, Eric Clapton was hugely influential to me and would definitely make my top 5 favorite rock guitar player list. And this album is just filled with awesome solos, tasty riffs, and a really incredible guitar tone from the pre-Stratocaster era from Eric Clapton when he was using the Gibson SG. And I think the tone that he got out of that guitar from this album was perfect for the different styles that they were blending in and out throughout these tracks. The songwriting is groovy and psychedelic, with a nice blend of originals and a few covers here and there. And this record spawned a couple of classic Cream hits with tracks like Strange Brew, Sunshine of Your Love, and Tales of Brave Ulysses. I think the B-sides on here are just as strong as the hits though, with a couple of my favorites being World of Pain, Dance the Night Away, and We're Going Wrong. I think Dance the Night Away in particular is one of the most underrated Cream songs of all time. And when it comes to, 60s psychedelic rock tracks, I think that song is about as good as it gets. And if I was to make a list of my top 10 favorite psychedelic rock songs, that would definitely make that list. So be sure to check that song out if you haven't. If you're a fan of psychedelic stuff, I think that song is absolutely incredible. And I also really love the track We're Going Wrong. That's another one that I think is a very underrated Cream song. It's a pretty dark song with an ominous sort of mood to it, and I really love the use of space. It just gives off such an eerie vibe that I love so much. And when Cream did the reunion at Royal Albert Hall, there's a live version of this song that I think is absolutely incredible, with a beautiful solo from Eric Clapton. Just a haunting song that I love so much. I never get tired of this track. So I think this album delivers on a lot of different fronts. When we're talking about, 60s guitar albums, it's great in that regard. When we're talking about blues albums, it definitely delivers on that front. And when we're talking about psychedelic rock albums, it's got a few tracks that certainly deliver on that front as well. So it's got a little bit of everything. And I think this album does a great job of incorporating the psychedelic elements that were prevalent during the time of its release, but also balancing it out with some more of, the blues and hard rock stuff, and just incorporating the flavors that are unique to Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, and Ginger Baker, and all of their wide varieties of influences and stylistic tendencies. So I think it's a great album that has a lot to offer to a lot of different types of music listeners, and would go down as my number one favorite Cream album. So that's my number 3. Now on to number 2. All right, coming in at number 2, we have the debut studio album by the Jimi Hendrix Experience titled Are You Experienced? Another guitar player that was hugely influential to me, especially in my formative years. This was one of the first guitar albums that I heard as a kid, and as soon as I heard it, I was hooked. This is just a masterpiece of an album and essential listening for any rock guitar player. Like I said, this was an album that I had heard very early in life. I remember when I was a kid, my dad had a big CD collection, and I would always go through and look at the covers, and I would pretty much just listen to things based on what the cover looked like. I was really young and I had no idea what I was listening to. But I remember as a kid, I always found the cover of this album very intriguing. The purple and yellow color scheme, and Hendrix and his bandmates in the yellow outfits with the purple background. It's incredibly psychedelic imagery, and obviously I wasn't aware of that as a kid, but just the color schemes and the way that the album looked and the font for the writing of the band name, I just thought it was all so cool, and that was, the main reason why I put it on and listened to it. And when I first heard it, I remember it completely blew my mind. And the CD that I had was the North American edition, so when I put it on, the opening track was Purple Haze, which is obviously a Hendrix classic, and when I first heard that, I was hooked. It was one of the first songs that really got me into the guitar, and from that point onward, this album just delivers one amazing song after the other. At certain points, it almost plays through like a greatest hits album, because there are so many gems throughout this record, with some other Hendrix classics like Manic Depression, Hey Joe, The Wind Cries Mary, Fire, and Foxy Lady. But I think it has some really solid B-side tracks that should not be overlooked either. My 2 personal favorites would be I Don't Live Today and the title track, Are You Experienced? Are You Experienced in particular, I think, is one of the most underrated Jimi Hendrix songs of all time. I think that song is so cool. I love the way it opens up with that reversed sound and then just segues into that main groove. Just such a cool sound, and just the overall vibe of this song is incredible. And in addition to the great songwriting, obviously it goes without saying that the guitar playing on this is just absolutely incredible. So many great and classic Hendrix solos all throughout this. My personal favorite would be Manic Depression, and it might actually be my number 1 favorite Jimi Hendrix solo. The way it starts out with those bends that he's singing along with, and then just goes into this blistering fast run. Just an absolutely insane solo that encompasses all of the great elements of Hendrix guitar playing within one solo. And when it comes to Jimi Hendrix's discography, even though it's pretty small, I would say that this is my number 1 favorite album of his. I think it's the most consistent from front to back. And when we're talking favorite Jimi Hendrix songs, this album also contains the largest amount of my favorite tracks by him as well, which is another huge thing in its favor. So this one was probably not a huge surprise to anybody, but this is my number 2 favorite album of 1967. Now for the grand reveal, here it is. This is my number 1 favorite album of 1967. All right, my number 1 favorite album of 1967 is Magical Mystery Tour by the Beatles. Sometimes I feel like I'm the odd man out when it comes to this one being my favorite Beatles album, because I feel like most people usually hold this album in high regard, but it doesn't seem to typically fall as people's number 1 favorite Beatles record. It's usually, I would say, somewhere in the top 5, and I think a lot of people tend to go more with either Rubber Soul or Revolver or Abbey Road or Sgt. Sgt. Pepper, which also came out from this year. And I'm sure some people are going to be disappointed that I chose this one over Sgt. Pepper, and that is certainly another incredible album. But for me, when I look through the track listing of this one, I just think this album is absolutely incredible from front to back. I think it is the peak psychedelic album from the Beatles. We had heard them start to introduce a little bit of psychedelic elements on Rubber Soul, and then go much deeper into it on Revolver. And then the album prior to this, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, went into a much more psychedelic direction as well, and this kind of continued off of that. And this album is 11 tracks long, with the first 6 tracks being part of the soundtrack to the film Magical Mystery Tour. And then side 2 consists of 5 more singles from 1967. And I've heard some people critique this album because of the first half being a soundtrack and the second half being singles, and saying that it doesn't have the most cohesive feel because of that. But I really think that all of these songs go great together from front to back. I like the variety from side 1 to side 2. I think it makes for a really fun listen. And I think the psychedelic elements are pretty prevalent all throughout these tracks, enough to really feel like a pretty consistent album, in my opinion. And I would say that side 1 is kind of more the B-sides of the album, with the exception of I Am the Walrus, which is obviously a Beatles classic. But there are some really exceptional and standout tracks on side 1, with songs like Fool on the Hill, Blue Jay Way, and Your Mother Should Know. Your Mother Should Know might be my number 1 favorite Beatles song. I did a video with a couple of friends a few years ago where we went through and discussed our top 10 favorite Beatles songs, and this one actually came in number 1 at the time of making that video, and it pretty consistently falls into that place. For some reason, I just absolutely love that song. I cannot get enough of it. And when it comes to the psychedelic side of the Beatles, I think Blue Jay Way is about as trippy as it gets, one of the coolest and most psychedelic songs that George Harrison has ever written. Then side 2 consists of the 5 singles that I had mentioned, and it basically plays through like a greatest hits album, with Beatles classics like Hello Goodbye, Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, and All You Need Is Love. And even though the 2 sides of this album were recorded and put together for different reasons, I think they work off of one another very nicely, and I like the contrast between side 1 and side 2. Like I said, we kind of get more of the deep cuts on side 1, and then side 2 gives us a nice little string of hits that everybody knows and loves. And when it comes to the psychedelic side of the Beatles, I think this album is them on top of their game. Like I said, this one pretty regularly falls as my number 1 favorite Beatles album. Sometimes I kind of veer between this and Revolver, depending on what mood I'm in. But more often than not, this one does fall in place as my number 1 Beatles album. And when I go through the track listing and I see how many exceptional songs there are and how many of my favorite Beatles tracks all happen within this album, it was pretty hard for me to argue that this is not my number 1 favorite album of 1967, because I just think there are so many gems all throughout this, and I think this is just a Beatles masterpiece and an incredible contribution to the year 1967. So that's my number 1, and that's it for today. So to recap, at number 5 we had Song Cycle by Van Dyke Parks. Number 4 we had Younger Than Yesterday by the Byrds. Number 3 we had Disraeli Gears by Cream. Number 2 we had Are You Experienced by the Jimi Hendrix Experience. And now number 1 we have Magical Mystery Tour by the Beatles. And if you haven't heard any of these albums before, please check them out and let me know what you think in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts. And please let me know your top 5 favorite albums of this year as well. And if I haven't heard any of them, I will be sure to check them out and let you know what I think. All right, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for my top 5 favorite albums of 1968. I'll see you then. Take care.